Welcome to week 7 of the Music of the Rolling Stones, 1962 to 1974. I've named this week, since it's the last week of the course, The End of an Era? And what we want to talk about this week is, in a certain way, kind of summarizing as far as we've gotten in the career of the Rolling Stones, which of course we all know as fans of the Rolling Stones music continues on well past 1974. We want to kind of summarize up this period from 1962 and we started through 1974. We spent a lot of time summarizing things from the group's career when we talked last week about Exile on Main Street. And we talked about that album, Exile on Main Street, as maybe being a kind of a high point of arrival for the Rolling Stones. And I used it as a kind of a lens to look back through the group's career going back to 1962. So it not only was it sort of a high point for the group, but also a kind of a culmination in a lot of kinds of ways of much that came before it. Now, in many ways, the next two albums, the ones that we'll focus on this week, Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll, begin looking in new directions. In other words, we'll start seeing things happening in these records that are really going to point forward towards some of the things that lie beyond the scope of this course, music from the Rolling Stones into the later 1970s and into the 1980s. Though these two albums are not without their continuities. In other words, they continue to have some of the same kinds of continuities we've been talking about, but also seem to be pointing in some new directions, and maybe there are some new influences I think we'll find on the Rolling Stones music from contemporary pop, rock, funk, soul from the 1970s. So that's a little bit of what we'll do. We'll try to keep an eye on both the continuities from the past as well as some of the ways in which these new directions will be explored. So as we conclude the class, having done a lot of our summarizing last week, we'll use these two albums to kind of reinforce some of those continuities, but see a shift toward some new things that'll become a part of the Rolling Stones sound and music. So with the rest of this video, let's talk about the year 1973, get an overview of that, and really we'll start that overview by having a look starting in late 1972. Now you may recall from last week, after the release of Exile on Main Street, the Stones go on their 7th U.S. tour during the summer of 1972, during June and July. And not too long after they finished that big American tour in November, December of 1972. Recording of the next album, Goat's Head Soup, begins. In January and February of 1973, however, recording work is interrupted for a while the group does a tour of Australia and New Zealand. We've seen those tours of Australia and New Zealand come up a number of times during our story. And then by May through June of 1973, the recording of Goat's Head Soup resumes. In August of 1973, the group releases the single Angie, with the B-side of that being Silver Train. That song, Angie, goes to number 1 in the US charts and number 5 in the UK charts. And at about the same time, the album Goat's Head Soup is released. That's August of 1973, going to number 1 in both the US and the UK. After the release, there's a September-October period of 1973 where the group tours Europe, and then they get back into the studio in November right away for sessions in Munich. To begin on working on the next album, It's Only Rock and Roll. In December of 1973, to end the year, the group releases a second single drawn from Goat's Head Soup, and that's the song Do 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 Heartbreaker, Dancing with Mr. D. If it's okay with you, I'm just going to call that song Heartbreaker, but we all know that it's Do 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 Heartbreaker in parentheses. Anyway, that track, as I said, released in December of 1973, goes to number 15 in the US. We've remarked about this before. Think about how much things are slowing down in terms of output from the group. Now, okay, there's in 1972, there's a big tour. The first half of 1973, there's several weeks in Australia and New Zealand. There's a European tour in September, October of 1973. Most of the rest of the time is spent working on this one album, and then the sessions at the end of the year begin on the next record. And so when we look at 1973, let's compare that with when we would do a 1963 overview and how much things have slowed down. We've accounted for that in a number of kinds of ways. One of them is that most groups are now more, like the Rolling Stones, are more interested in albums than they are in singles, so they haven't got to keep releasing a single every 3 months. Even though during this period, they do get a single out in August, Angie, and Heartbreaker out in December. So in other words, there's a lot of time spent in the studio and a lot less time sort of pushing the band as in previous years. Well, that gives us kind of an overview of late 1972 and 1973. So let's turn to that album that was the big focus of 1973 for the group. How do you follow up on Exile on Main Street? That would be Goat's Head Soup.